Jamaica, land of wooden streams, as the name meant in Aboriginal tongue, was discovered by Christopher Columbus on his second voyage to the Western Hemisphere. He followed a course that took him through the Lesser Antilles until he reached Hispaniola, where he paused to establish a permanent colony. But his urge to explore and to find gold drove him on. Turning south from Cuba, he glimpsed a new mass taking form upon the horizon. "It is the fairest island that eyes have beheld," said Columbus when he saw Jamaica on the morning of the 5th May, 1494. He approached the north coast, but the Arawak Indians were unfriendly, so Columbus steered westward. He stopped at a dry harbor, now called Discovery Bay, and sent a few of his men ashore. Again the Arawaks threatened, but the Spaniards made friends with them, exchanging trinkets for their beads and soft metal ornaments. Modern Jamaica does what it can to reconstruct the picture of life among these gentle, cinnamon-colored people whom Columbus saw. Learned societies dig for relics in Arawak kitchen middens. A midden is the rubbish heap that stood behind the settlement, where bones, broken utensils, and other discarded objects were thrown. Often a good tool or an ornament would get mixed in with the trash. Columbus went on to Rio Bueno in search of water. There he met with success. Boats from his ships visited the beach and entered the mouth of the river where his water casks were filled. Upon his return to Spain, Queen Isabella asked him to describe this Jamaica which he praised so highly. The story goes that he took a piece of paper, crumpled it in one hand, and dropped it on the table. The irregularities of the paper did suggest a mountainous island, as can be seen when compared with this relief map of Jamaica, which brings out the country's abrupt contrast of peaks and valleys. Columbus did not attempt to colonize Jamaica. It was not until 1509 that his own son, Diego, who had been made governor of Hispaniola, sent over Juan de Esquivel with 70 men. Esquivel landed at Santa Gloria and began the building of a capital called Sevilla la Nueva. None of the structures of Sevilla remain above ground, but the Institute of Jamaica and the Jamaica Historical Society are excavating there with good results. Various fascinating relics have been found in the soil nearby. For instance, a coin bearing the head of Queen Isabella, the monarch who sponsored the great voyage that resulted in the discovery of the New World. Most interesting of all is a series of stone carvings, some of them taken from the well into which they must have been thrown for safety. Their artistic merit is high. They are to be seen at the Institute's museum in Kingston. Various other objects of Spanish origin have been discovered. Also, more surprisingly, many objects of Arawak origin. The English came to Jamaica 300 years ago. The expedition commanded by Penn and Venables entered Kingston harbor and sailed close to the western shore opposite the tip of Palisadoes, then to the mouth of the Rio Cobre. A defense called the Passage Fort stood there. Feebly manned, it was carried without difficulty, and the English proclaimed Jamaica annexed. This was only the prelude to guerrilla warfare. The native-born Christopher Ronaldo Yisati used a narrow-mast inlet near St. Anne's Bay as a hiding place, which was called after him Don Christopher's Cove. In 1658, he received additional troops and cannons from Cuba, so he built a fort at Rio Nuevo as the starting point for regaining control. Here, Doyle must have put his men ashore from the ships that had brought them from the south coast. 6 times, the records tell us, the English charged before they were successful. Guns thundered from both the fort and the ships. Rio Nuevo was fatal to the Spanish cause. Peace was restored, and Jamaica became securely British. Fortifications were erected in an early date by the English for the defense of Jamaica against all comers. The first and most important was Fort Charles at Port Royal. It was begun in 1656 by General Sedgwick, before there was even a village at the point. Twice remodeled and enlarged, the first time by Sir Henry Morgan the Buccaneer, it was formidable in that age. These gun embrasures, where the rusty cannons still frown, formed battlements that men would have hesitated to storm. More than a century after it was built, Horatio Nelson, as a young officer, commanded Fort Charles. Here is the platform, Nelson's quarterdeck, which he used to pace, looking out to sea, hoping the French would attack and give him a chance at glory. It became necessary to have stronger works than Fort Charles, so Fort Augusta was built on the western side of Kingston Harbor. The impressive ruins might lead a visitor to think that it had endured a terrible siege. Actually, Fort Augusta never fired a shot. It was blown up when its powder magazine was struck by lightning. Beneath these placid waters lie a part of Port Royal. In the background, a waterfront street that once stood well inland marks the line where the city of Buccaneers was cleft in the great earthquake of 1692. And at least half of the business district sunk below the waves. Port Royal is being rebuilt after the hurricane of 1951. And there's little else to see of historic value except St. Peter's Church. In the yard near the east door lies the grave of Louis Goldie, which carries the most famous inscription on a tomb in all Jamaica. Goldie was swallowed when the earth closed upon him, then tossed out by the quake into the harbor where he was picked up by a boat. He lived on over 40 years and became a rich merchant. Inside the church there is a plaque to Goldie as one of its founders and first church warden. These communion vessels are reputed to have been given by Sir Henry Morgan. Slave artisans carved this organ loft early in the 18th century. Opposite Port Royal, was once the maritime outlet for the Spanish town, replacing Passage Fort. The warehouses and taverns that flourish there are now but hollow shells where children play. The tides of commerce now flow in other directions, chiefly through the growing metropolis of Kingston. Spanish Town, the second capital under the Spaniards, and the first under the English rule, can never lose its charm and historical value. The central square is a pure Spanish plaza, which has lasted unaltered except for the fine 18th century buildings that surround it. The House of Assembly is on the east side. It has recently been restored, and the spacious rooms are used for parish purposes. This is the entrance to Old King's House, where English governors lived for more than 100 years. On the north side of the square is the record office, and also a handsome memorial to Admiral George B. Rodney, who by winning the naval Battle of the Saints, saved Jamaica from capture by the French. The statue of Rodney is by John Bacon, the leading English sculptor of the period. The carved embellishments of the memorial are symbolic of victory. At a short distance from the square is this dwelling house of Georgian architecture. It is the survival of the days of gracious living in the old capital. The cathedral is the most ancient monument of all. It is on the foundations of a Spanish church and has been twice reconstructed. This is Jamaica's Westminster Abbey. Many of the early settlers, military leaders and governors are buried here. Some lie in vaults beneath the pavements of the building, and others in the churchyard. Pause before the memorial of the Earl and Countess of Effingham. It is by John Bacon, the sculptor of the Rodney statue, and is regarded as the finest piece of art in Jamaica. Effingham served as governor. Beneath this slab rests Colonel John Colbeck, an officer in the army that conquered the Spaniards. Colbeck built a huge structure near Spanish Town, partly as a residence, partly as a fort, where the militia could gather to repel invaders. It came to be known as Colbeck Castle. Generations of travelers have visited the imposing ruins. Equally famous is Rose Hall Great House, or what is left of it. The beautiful but evil Annie Palmer lived there more than a century ago. She poisoned a succession of husbands and was at last killed by her own slaves. Stokes Hall was another and older great house, gutted by fire in recent times. Falmouth Courthouse on the north coast is a showplace, the best example of a Georgian public building in Jamaica. The country has always depended mainly upon agriculture. Who has not read about the sugar bonanza of the 18th century, which in turn was the cause of the slave trade with Africa? Primitive devices such as this crumbling base of a windmill to generate power have been abandoned. Coffee, too, is cured by modern methods. But the pulping wheel and the broad barbecue are not quite so outdated as the sugar mill of the same period. Blue Mountain coffee is still dried on barbecues. The first botanical garden was established at Bath in St. Thomas. Luckily, some of the original areas have been preserved as a park. The object in the 18th century was to naturalize valuable plants. For introducing the breadfruit from the South Seas, Captain Bligh was paid a bonus of 1,000 guineas. The ackee came from Africa to be combined with swordfish as Jamaica's national dish. Mangoes of various kinds originated in India. The Spaniards had grown bananas from the Canary Islands, but the English cultivated superior species. Filippo's Chapel in Spanish Town commemorates the struggle for Negro emancipation. In this chapel in Spanish Town, the Reverend James M. Filippo preached ardently against slavery. He wrote a book dealing with his experiences. Edward Jordan, far-sighted statesman, demanded and obtained civil rights for those colored persons who had been freed before the General Act. A statue of him stands at East Parade and East Queen Street in downtown Kingston. George William Gordon, who had been born a slave, championed the cause of the depressed masses some years after the emancipation. He died a martyr as a result of the Morant Bay Rebellion, which he had not incited. The name derives from the attack on Morant Bay Courthouse by a band of peasants led by Paul Bogle. Jamaica's loveliest exhibits are her vivid blossoming trees. A few must suffice. This is the Cassia fistula, with its golden clusters. This is the acacia. This, the spathodia, or flame of the forest. This, the lignum vitae. And most gorgeous of all, the scarlet poinciana. Against the lush background of emerald vegetation, these colors proclaim the words of Columbus. It is the fairest island that eyes have beheld.